Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Monday Mornings at Maine online edition. My name is Heather Miller, and I'm an adult programming librarian here at the La Crosse Public Library. And I'm so glad you could join us for our special presentation today. We all know it's been a very eventful election season this year, and we have made history for sure, but it's also a wonderful opportunity for us to reflect on the past and those that have come before us to make history in election and voting. So today we have a special guest with us, Simone Munson from the Wisconsin Historical Society. And she's going to be speaking to us about working for the right to vote and the women's suffrage movement in Wisconsin. So thanks for joining us, Simone.
Not a problem. Thanks for having me. I have had the opportunity, I guess, to travel around the state for close to a year before COVID hit, and then virtually traveling around the state since March. Talking about the history of the suffrage movement and the role that Wisconsin women played in the suffrage movement in particularly. And it's been a really interesting year. And I've learned a lot about what people know about the suffrage movement, what people think the suffragists did, and sort of how that sort of fits into the broader picture of women's history, of the history of people fighting for rights and civil rights, and it's been a really good learning experience for me. So one of the most common questions that I get when I do this presentation, or before I started doing this presentation, one of the most common questions we would get about the suffrage movement is, when did it start? You know, when did the suffrage movement start? When did women start advocating for the right to vote? And I sort of like to answer that question by saying that as long as there have been women, there have been women advocating for women's rights. But in terms of our nation and advocating for the right to vote, in particular, we can go all the way back to our founding fathers or our founding mothers, and see that the women of our country were advocating for women's rights from the get-go. Abigail Adams wrote to her husband often as he was making his trips to Philadelphia to work on the Constitution and the Declaration and all of those sort of foundational documents that ended up creating our country. And in one of her letters in March of 1776, she wrote, "I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." And in some ways, the story of the suffrage movement is the story of the that rebellion that Abigail Adams kind of rightly predicted. And so we do see that there are women advocating for women's rights through the beginning of the 19th century. But most historians, if we think about the movement as having a beginning and an end, we sort of have artificially dated the movement to beginning in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention. There was a large convention. It's sometimes called the first women's rights convention to take place in the United States in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. This was a two-day event where women were able to meet and talk about the issues that were and how they saw themselves fitting into the political sphere, what they thought, not just about voting, but about other issues that faced women in their daily lives and how they intersected with politics and business and the economy. On the first day of speaking, they only allowed women into the convention. It was women only. And, you know, this was done in part so that women felt comfortable to express their ideas and to really sort of promote conversation. On the second day of the convention, they allowed men to come to the convention. And this was done for a couple of reasons. First was because they realized that if they were going to be successful in their endeavors to advocate for women's rights, that they needed to convince men that this was also an important issue because men had control of the government. And secondly, the Seneca Falls Convention was not just a women's rights convention, it was also an abolitionist convention. And Frederick Douglass, the famous African-American orator, was there, and he spoke on the second day of the convention. And so the intersection between the abolitionist movement and the women's suffrage movement goes back to the 1840s. As both of these underrepresented groups are continuing to advocate for more rights and equality. There was a woman named Louise Smith, who was a Wisconsin resident, who was at the Seneca Falls Convention. She was just a child when she traveled to New York with her family to participate in the convention, and she is one of only 2 women who actually lives until 1920 and is able to cast a vote in 1920 who attended that convention. So that little newspaper article in the corner of this slide is a picture of Louise Smith in December of 1920. I'm talking about how she had traveled to New York and participated in the convention at a young age, and then, saw the entire women's movement till its successful endpoint in 1920, where she was able to cast her first ballot. The Seneca Falls Convention gets a lot of attention, partially because it is associated with 2 of the most famous suffragists of the movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony actually did not attend the Seneca Falls Convention. Her mother and her sister attended, but she was not there. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton was there. She was a strong participant in the Seneca Falls Convention. And it's really after this convention that she starts to build a name and reputation for herself as a speaker. She begins publishing her newspaper called The Revolution, and she starts to visit other states and help women in other states begin to organize. And really the organization of the movement is kind of how the rest of this presentation, this talk is organized. When we think about modern movements like the civil rights movement and a lot of the sort of equal rights protesting and organizing that's happened in the 20th century, there are certain elements that we associate with those. And they have to do with different parts of civic engagement and how we engage with our representatives and how we sort of make our needs and wants known within our government. And while the suffrage movement was definitely not the first movement to use these elements, it was a very long movement. It's over 75 years that it takes before women are granted the right to vote. And they use different strategies at different times. And so part of what I want to talk about this morning is the different strategies that were used at different times and whether or not they were successful, how they sort of moved the movement forward, and then how Wisconsin sort of intersected with those different efforts. Because of how long the movement is, it's difficult to talk about it in chronological order. So this presentation is roughly in chronological order, but we do kind of skip forward and skip back a little bit, which is sort of unavoidable. So, the Seneca Falls Convention takes place in 1848, and really this is sort of seen as the moment when organization starts to happen. We start to see women organizing around this common cause, trying to build an infrastructure for spreading the word and figuring out how they're going to accomplish this goal. And there's 2 important elements in building this infrastructure. The first is organizing what we now call women's clubs or suffrage clubs and the press. So in terms of women's clubs, we see women's clubs. Hold on just one second. I'm so sorry.
Where's my band instrument?
I'm sorry, what?
Where's my band instrument?
In the basement?
No.
Yeah, it is. Honey, I'm in the middle of something right now. Okay, it's down in the basement, I promise. I'm sorry. There's 4 kids trying to do school off camera. So hopefully that's our only interruption, but we'll see how this goes. So the women's club movement starts to get organized in the 1860s. In the 1860s is when we see the Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association is first founded. These women's clubs are made up primarily of middle-class white women at first. There are not a lot of African Americans or Native Americans who are included in the women's clubs. It is a very sort of divided movement. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But the women's clubs are really how things get started. If you can imagine sort of, a hierarchy of an organization where you might have a statewide umbrella or a national umbrella organization, and then these sort of local clubs that are established throughout the state and throughout the country. That is how women are advocating for suffrage. They're trying to make their community understand why women's suffrage is important. They're sharing strategies with other women's clubs around the state and around the country about what is working and what is not. And they're also trying to recruit members. I mentioned already that in Seneca Falls, they knew the importance of having to convince men that suffrage was a good idea. But the other thing that they had to convince was other women. It wasn't a natural given that women would support the suffrage movement. And through much of the 19th century, the biggest advocacy that needed to be done was to convince women that these issues were important. Suffrage was not the only issue that the women's clubs concerned themselves with. They also took on a lot of social welfare issues, things like education, the rights of children, even the rights of prisoners. These sort of typical sort of social and welfare issues were sort of thought to be more appropriate for women to sort of take up than for men to sort of be focused on. So these women's clubs also spent time doing that. The 2 women that are pictured in this slide are Theodora Yeomans, who is holding the flag, and then a woman named Mrs. Carrie Horton, who is an African-American woman in Milwaukee. I mentioned that the movement, that the women's club movement often did not include African-American women. They did start their own separate segregated clubs. And there is sort of a parallel movement that's happening as white women are advocating for rights. African-American women are launching their own campaigns and advocating for their rights as well. Both of these women led women's organizations in the state of Wisconsin for many, many years. Mrs. Carrie Horton was the president of the Women's Improvement Club, which was the African-American women's club in Milwaukee, and Theodora Yeomans led the women's clubs of Wisconsin for many, many years in the early 20th century. So these women are sort of at the center of organizing these clubs and sort of advocating for the rights of women. Theodora Yeomans was also a journalist, which sort of leads me to talk about the next sort of infrastructure element that was needed for the beginning of the movement for spreading information. We see that the press is widely used throughout the 75-year period to spread the word, to convince people that suffrage is an important issue and to sort of lay their argument out for why this is something that people should care about. Elizabeth Cady Stanton starts the Revolution, which is the first women's newspaper in the United States in the 1850s. And then shortly after that, we see in 1870, a woman named Lucy Stone starts the Woman's Journal. The Woman's Journal is one of the longest running women's newspapers in the United States. And Lucy Stone was from Massachusetts and was an early advocate for women's suffrage. She believed in keeping her own name. She didn't change her name. She also refused to pay taxes because she wasn't represented within government. And so she starts this newspaper in 1870 to sort of start advocating for a lot of these issues and telling women about the different ways that they can protest and participate in government. Eventually, her daughter, Alice Stone Blackwell, takes over as the editor of the paper. Alice Stone Blackwell is one of the first women to graduate from Boston University in 1881. And then she joins the editorial staff of the Women's Journal, and later takes over the editorship and becomes a pretty radical suffragist herself. Theodora Yeomans, our Wisconsin example, was born in Ashippun, Wisconsin in 1863. She was able to attend the Carroll Academy and some of the other schools in Waukesha County. So she's a middle-class educated woman in Wisconsin in the 1860s and 70s. In the 1880s, she becomes a freelance writer and she begins working for the Waukesha Freeman. And during this period of time, she is restricted to covering topics that are sort of considered appropriate for women. So things like local travel, food, sort of the what's happening in the community and other things like that. She actually gains popularity really quickly, and she is one of the first female journalists in the state to earn her own byline, and eventually becomes not just a freelance writer, but a regular staff writer for the Waukesha Freeman. In the 20th century, as her career continues and her involvement in women's role in politics continues, she eventually becomes the official writer for the suffrage movement in Wisconsin. And in 1911, she begins writing a weekly column on the suffrage movement that's not only published in the Waukesha Freeman, but is also syndicated and published in other newspapers around the state, so that other newspapers can publish these resources as well. This weekly article about the suffrage movement is one of the best resources that we have on studying the suffrage movement in Wisconsin. We can see specifically what parts of the movement are successful in the state, where rallies are taking place, where fundraising is happening, and how that the movement is sort of working and moving throughout the state. That is Lucy Stone Blackwell and Lucy Stone and Alice Stone Blackwell. Okay, so intersectionality is a term that we hear a lot today. It's a modern term. It wouldn't have been used in the same way in the 19th century and the early 20th century. But even given our modern definition of intersectionality, we see a lot of different elements of intersectionality that happen within the suffrage movement. So I mentioned already the abolitionist movement. In the 1840s, 50s, 60s, and early 1870s, we see that there is a strong alignment with the abolitionist movement. But we can also see where there's a divide, that this movement, the abolitionist movement, and the African American civil rights movement and the suffrage movement are not always in alignment. In the 1840s, 50s, and then right up through the Civil War, there is a lot of intersectionality between the abolitionist movement and the suffrage movement. These two groups are working very closely together. If you look at the sort of travel schedule and where women like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are traveling during their speaking tours, oftentimes you'll find prominent abolitionists like Frederick Douglass appearing with them. And so these two movements are very closely aligned. When after the Civil War ends and the federal government starts to take up the issue of African American suffrage, you can see that there's a lot of advocacy that's happening for the 15th Amendment, that the 15th Amendment should not only address the issue of African American suffrage, but also the issue of gender or women's suffrage in the drafting of that amendment. as the efforts for that amendment move forward, it becomes clear that the federal government is not going to include women's suffrage in the amendment. And this is one of the important breaking points within the movement. Both Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony come out not supporting the 15th Amendment. They come out against the 15th Amendment because they don't think that it goes far enough to include women's suffrage. And it's sort of from this point forward that we see that the African-American civil rights movement and the suffrage movement start to diverge, and they're not as aligned as they had been in the past. After the passage of the 15th Amendment, and as the women's clubs across the country start to be organized in the 1860s and the 1870s, there's also a lot of difficult choices that women have to make about how they align themselves with the African-American civil rights movement. Many of the Southern women's clubs came out and said that if African-American women were included in Northern women's clubs, that they would just refuse to support those clubs or refuse to attend parades and rallies or meetings, like group meetings that were happening across the country, and they wouldn't attend. And so ultimately, most of the women's clubs throughout the United States end up being segregated, as I sort of already talked about. And these movements end up sort of having very parallel tracks. A lot of the same strategies are used by all women's groups, but they are definitely segregated at different times. The other thing to realize is that that the women's suffrage movement was not 100% sort of equal in the way that we think about equality today. It would have been very, very common for suffragists to believe that really only white women deserved the right to vote and that they did not believe in advocating for African-American suffrage as well. So those two things are not always sort of the same. There's a much different definition of what equal rights for women means in the 19th and early 20th century. So the other area where we see a lot of intersectionality throughout the second half of the 19th century and the early 20th century is with the temperance movement. The woman pictured here is Frances Willard, and she is the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She is not born in Wisconsin, but she grew up in Janesville, and she attended the Milwaukee Normal Institute. And Frances Willard is the Women's Christian Temperance Union existed long before Frances Willard became their president, and the idea of temperance and restricting access to alcohol was a popular movement throughout the 19th century. But under the presidency of Frances Willard, this is the first time that we start to see alignment between the suffrage movement and the temperance movement. So in the 1880s, Frances Willard makes this argument that in order for the temperance movement to be successful, women need to have the right to vote. And part of her rationale for this is the idea of what she calls home protection. And she describes home protection as a movement where the object of which is to secure for women above the age of 21 the ballot as a means to protect their home from the devastation caused by legalized traffic of strong drink. The devastation that she talks about is violent acts against women committed by intoxicated men, which was common both inside and outside the home. So Frances Willard argued that it was too easy for men to get away with their crimes if women didn't have the right to vote. And so making this connection between home protection, women's safety, and temperance brings alignment between the temperance movement and the suffrage movement. And we see the suffrage movement grow enormously in the 1880s and 1890s using this argument. You maybe can imagine that This was not a popular argument in Wisconsin. Wisconsin being such a strong German state and being one of the leaders in beer production in the entire country, the idea of temperance in Wisconsin was not a popular idea. And we do see Wisconsin suffragists actively sort of campaigning against temperance or trying to keep themselves separated from the temperance movement. So where this was a very successful argument in a lot of Midwestern states like Illinois, Kentucky, Indiana, we see that it's less successful in Wisconsin and that they're actively trying to sort of keep these ideas separate. Okay, so what strategies are they actually using? How are they actually advocating for suffrage to take place, and what progress are they making? So the best way to talk about this is to think about kind of our civics lesson, and we know that there's different levels of government. There's the federal government, state government, and local and municipal government. And there's a large group of suffragists that are advocating for an amendment or laws at the federal level to allow women to vote. But there's other women who think that the strategy should be to advocate at the local and state level for women to have the right to vote and kind of build up a base of state support before the federal support is achieved. And this is often called the state by state movement. And there is a lot of work that goes into this movement in the second half of the 19th century. And there's a couple of things that are kind of interesting about this movement. And I really like the map that's on this slide because it demonstrates a couple of different things. First, so on this map, you can see that the lightest colored states have granted equal suffrage to women so they can vote in all state elections. The sort of gray areas have granted some partial suffrage, or there's a question actually on the ballot. This map was published in 1911, 1912, around then. And so you can see some question marks on this map where there are states that are currently have pending legislation that might determine if women have partial suffrage or the right to vote in some elections. And then the dark states are states where women have no right to vote in any form. So one of the things that's sort of interesting about the women's suffrage movement is that it is a movement that moves from west to east. It finds its most success in the west, and then it slowly works its way east. Oftentimes when we think of political movements in our country, we think of them sort of starting on the East Coast and moving west, when in fact the suffrage movement was the opposite. Wyoming is actually the first state to grant women the right to vote in all state elections. It is written into their state constitution in 1869. And this is done, we know from their constitutional convention records that this is done in an effort to attract women to the territory. So Wyoming does not have a large female population, and they're trying to attract more women. And they think that if they give women the right to vote, they might want to come live there. I think it's only partially successful, but it's successful enough that we see other states follow suit. Idaho, Utah, Colorado, Washington, they all eventually grant women statewide suffrage. Those gray states are doing things like granting partial suffrage, and the partial suffrage is granted in specific types of elections. So in Illinois, for example, and in Kentucky, we see women given the right to vote in school elections, or because of that alignment with the temperance movement, we see women given the right to vote for issues like liquor licenses. So women would have been on committees or allowed to vote for the approval of liquor licenses. And it's a lot of these sort of issues that are sort of deemed appropriate for women. So oftentimes it has to do with school, education, the treatment of children, other welfare issues like that women are allowed to vote in. In Wisconsin, we see this come to our state in the 1880s. In 1886, Wisconsin pushes for a referendum to allow women to vote in school matters. And we always put school matters in quotation marks because it's very, very poorly written legislation. And that's the wording that's used in the legislation in 1886. But it doesn't really define what that is. And it's, like I said, poorly written legislation that doesn't provide much of an infrastructure for how women are supposed to exercise that right to vote. And so the woman whose image is here is the Reverend Olympia Brown. She is a Unitarian minister from Racine, who's living in Racine, Wisconsin at the time. And in 1887, she decides that she is going to test this right to vote. So she goes to the polls in 1887 and she knows that the legislation is fairly poorly written. And so she looks at her ballot and she says, okay, I'm allowed to vote in things related to school matters. So I can obviously vote for school board. So I'm going to vote for school board. And then, you know, the mayor of my community, he impacts schools a lot. So I'm going to vote for mayor. The treasurer of the county impacts what money the schools get. So I'm going to vote for treasurer. And she goes through the ballot and she decides to vote for those offices that she thinks impact schools. She goes to turn her ballot in and immediately the people working at the polls can see what the problem is. There's two big problems. One is this problem that I've already alluded to, is that there's no clear definition of what school matters mean. So she turns in her ballot and the poll workers that say, well, you can't vote for all those things. Those aren't school matters. You're only allowed to vote for school board. And she says, well, it doesn't say that. And I think school matters means all these things. So she tries to vote for all of them. The second issue is that voting is meant to be anonymous, and there's not a separate ballot that's been printed for the women. So if voting is meant to be anonymous, then there's no way for women to vote anonymously if their ballots have to be checked to make sure that they voted for the right offices. They can't just turn their ballot in and leave. And so this immediately sort of raises a really large issue within how the elections are going to be run. So Olympia Brown takes the case to court and sort of tests this law. And unfortunately, this turns into a legal battle that lasts quite some time. So it takes from 1887 all the way up till about 1900 or 1901 before this issue is resolved. And it's partially unresolved because of this issue of printing two separate ballots. The state has rules that say that they're not supposed to print two separate ballots for any given polling place. And so this really sort of calls into question how the voting process works in the state, and it takes a very, very long time for it to be resolved. In 1901, women in Wisconsin are finally able to vote in school matters after they come up with a better definition of what that means and how the voting will work. Wisconsin also interacts with the state-by-state movement in one other way. In 1912, there is a large effort to, in the 1910, there's a large effort to get a statewide suffrage amendment added to the state constitution. And this is a really complicated thing. So in order to add an amendment to the state constitution of Wisconsin, what needs to happen is a bill needs to go through the state legislature in 1 year. And then the very next year, when the state legislature meets again, the same bill has to go through and be approved again a second time. And then after being approved in 2 consecutive sessions of the legislature, it goes to the state for a vote. And if it passes a state referenda vote, then it can be added to the Constitution. So we see in Wisconsin that in the 1880s and 90s, there are attempts to pass a state referenda for Wisconsin women to be able to vote in all state elections, but those efforts are unsuccessful. In 1910 and 1911, we finally see a bill get through the 2 consecutive sessions of the state legislature, and so it goes to a statewide referendum in 1912. You can imagine that the suffrage organizations across the state sort of go into high gear, and they're all trying to organize and convince the men of our country or our state that this is an important issue and that they should vote in favor of women's suffrage. Probably the most vocal advocate during this 1911-1912 period is a woman named Ada James. Ada James was born and raised in Richland Center, and she is the founder of the Women's Political Equality League. It is an offshoot of the Wisconsin Suffrage Association. After those two, there was a split within the organization on a few different issues. And so women sort of splintered into 2 groups. Ada founds the Political Equality League, and it's this effort through this organization that she takes up a lot of what we would call grassroots organizing. So she does a lot of things like printing leaflets, holding meetings, getting speeches. She does a lot of things that are kind of considered unconventional for 1911. She hires a motorboat to distribute leaflets along the Wolf River. She hires an airplane to drop brochures over a crowd at a county fair. And you have to think like a motorboat, or not a motorboat, but an airplane would have been something that people would not have seen very often. So it would have really attracted people's attention to see an airplane, and then to have it drop leaflets over a fair would have been like kind of a spectacle. The other sort of element of that was she organized driving tours where women would sort of get in automobiles and drive around the state. They would stop in certain communities and give sort of speeches from the automobile in a town square. And it was the same idea. Automobiles were not very common in 1911, 1912. And so just the fact that you had these women driving into town in an automobile, that would have attracted a lot of attention, and people would have come to listen to these speeches. So she does a lot of organizing, trying to advocate for women to get the right to vote in 1912, for men to vote for this amendment. Unfortunately, the referendum does not pass. It loses pretty steeply. It was 135,736 in favor and 227,054 votes against. So it lost by, it was 62.6% to 37.4%. So a pretty resounding no in terms of the men of Wisconsin saying that they don't want women to have the right to vote across the state. And one of the outcomes of the failed amendment referendum in 1912 is that we see a lot of Wisconsin suffragists at this point say that they don't think that the state by state movement is working for them, that Wisconsin, it's not going to work in Wisconsin, and they start to turn their attention to the federal amendment, to the federal movement and getting women the right to vote at a federal level. So I talked a little bit about, the press and getting organized, how women are sort of testing a legal precedent and expanding their rights. We talked a little bit about intersectionality. Another element of sort of civic engagement that women use throughout this 70-year period is peaceful protest. And the idea of peaceful protest is used in a lot of different ways at different times, but we really see marches, parades, and sort of demonstrations become more popular in the 19-teens. This is in part because of a woman named Alice Paul, who's not from Wisconsin, but she she starts organizing these really large scale parades and marches across the country. The 1913 march in Washington, D.C. that takes place the day before President Wilson's inauguration was one of the largest parades ever to take place in the state capitol until just recently, actually, with the Women's March that took place in 2017. And so, you know, these are large scale organizations and protests that are happening across the country. There's also a very memorable parade that takes place in 1916 at the Republican National Convention in Chicago. The Republican National Convention was happening in Chicago that year to get ready to vote for the president, and women from across the country showed up to Chicago. It was a very windy, very rainy day, but they did march outside down Michigan Avenue, protesting for a woman's right to vote. If you've ever seen pictures of Wisconsin suffragists where they're wearing sort of a tunic looking thing over their dresses that says Wisconsin down the center, these were bright yellow tunics. And this is the parade that Wisconsin suffragists wore those tunics to. Those were made for that 1916 parade in Chicago. So these types of demonstrations are becoming more popular. President Wilson does run on an anti-women's suffrage campaign. He believes that women's suffrage should be an issue that's left to the states and that the federal government should not get involved in this issue. And so that's his official platform, which is part of the reason why they organized this huge parade in 1913 to march down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House, letting President Wilson know that, or soon to be President Wilson, that that the women are here, that they are going to be heard, that this issue is not going away. Another way that they demonstrate that is Alice Paul organizes what's called the Silent Sentinels. This is a group of over 1,000 women who picketed outside the White House for more than 18 months in 1917. It was quite a spectacle. The idea was that they wanted to be present so that every time President Wilson looked out the windows of the White House, they would see these women standing there with their signs and their banners, letting them know that this issue wasn't going to go away, kind of an ever presence in his life. There was a lot of harassment that these women endured. They were verbally and physically attacked on multiple occasions. Many of them were arrested. Eventually, Alice Paul is arrested and jailed, hoping that would sort of get the women to stop protesting outside the White House. That doesn't work. Alice Paul also tries a hunger strike where she refuses to eat while she's imprisoned. They threatened to send her to an insane asylum. And so there's a lot of sort of backlash to these Silent Sentinels. But you know, the protesting continues even as the United States enters World War I, and the conversation around women's roles in society starts to change. So ultimately, what ends up sort of turning the tide is sort of creating relevancy within the women's suffrage movement for what is happening within the current political climate. And World War I plays a very, very large role in that. The woman in the lower right-hand corner of this image is a woman named Carrie Chapman Catt. She is the president of the National Association of Women's Suffrage Associations from 1915 to 1920. And during that time, she devises what is often referred to as the winning plan, the winning argument, which is a carefully coordinated state suffrage campaign for a constitutional amendment that aligns the state advocacy and the federal advocacy, and it brings in elements of women's roles in World War I. So oftentimes when we think of women playing an important role in the war effort, we sort of think of Rosie the Riveter in World War II, but all of those same things that we associate with World War II, they all happened during World War I as well. Women took over important roles in factories, in businesses, in farms, making sure that our country had enough ammunition, that people were fed, that there were nurses and that men were cared for on the front lines. All of those same things that we associate with World War II are happening during World War I. And it's this sort of argument about how the role that women play in the economy, in politics during World War I, that ultimately ends up being more successful. The other element that is brought into sharper focus during the war is that American suffragists were promoting the idea of universal suffrage as the only right path for a civilized nation. And they used examples of other countries that had already adopted universal suffrage, such as Canada, England, Russia, Denmark, Italy. So even before the United States enters the war in 1917, American women begin participating in war-related events, including the International Congress of Women in the Netherlands, which took place in 1915. And helped to argue for like the principles of permanent peace. So the peace movement throughout the world that's happening at that time is another area where we see a lot of advocacy for universal suffrage. And as World War I continues on, and as the United States enters the war, suddenly the United States' stance on women's suffrage starts to seem more backwards than it had before. This is especially true considering that Germany had granted women the right to vote, and we were trying to portray the Germans as barbarous during World War I. So eventually this argument of using the war as a way to demonstrate women's role in politics is successful. And in September of 1918, President Wilson formally changes his stance on women's suffrage, and he says, "I regard the concurrence of the Senate in the constitutional amendment proposing the extension of suffrage to women as vitally essential to the successful prosecution of the great war of humanity in which we are engaged." So, you know, the World War I had sort of laid bare the unequal nature of American society, and President Wilson changes his mind, encourages the Senate to take up this issue. In May of 1919, the federal legislature votes on the amendment, and they get ready to send the amendment to the states in June. So now we begin sort of the story of the ratification process for the 19th Amendment. So we're almost to the end of our 75 years here. It's taken us a while to get there. But what happens is after the federal legislature passes the amendment, then it has to go to the states for ratification. At the time, it needed 36 states to ratify the amendment. And the Secretary of State gets materials ready for the states to vote in June of 1919. It just so happens that Wisconsin's legislature was in session in June of 1919. This is a rare occurrence. It was a budget year and the state hadn't passed its state budget yet. And so they needed to get that finished. And so the legislature was in special session. There were a lot of suffragists around the state who were very interested in getting Wisconsin to pass the amendment early. There were a few that were hoping that Wisconsin could even be one of the first states to ratify the 19th Amendment. So they're using their influence with local politicians, with the governor, to convince the legislature to take up this issue as soon as possible. So when the paperwork arrives from Washington, the Wisconsin state legislature is able to take up the amendment almost immediately. And on June 10th, 1919, Wisconsin state legislature votes in favor of the suffrage amendment. And there's a lot of suffragists outside the Capitol. There's a lot of people sort of milling about because they know that this is an issue that is likely to be taken up that day. And among those people outside the Capitol that day are Ada James and her father, David James. David James was a retired state legislator, and he was Ada's father and had been a longtime suffrage advocate as well. And so they're kind of waiting to hear, and while all these suffragists are waiting to hear, they hear that Illinois has already voted on the amendment. And so people are a little deflated because they really had hoped that Wisconsin would be the first to ratify. One of the people in the crowd points out that, it's not official until you get your paperwork to Washington. So if we could get our papers to Washington faster than Illinois, then Wisconsin would be the first state to ratify. So they convinced Governor Emanuel to write a special order allowing someone to take the paperwork to Washington on a fast train. And they look around and they convinced David James that he should go. Well, David had taken the train from Richland Center into Madison that morning just to sort of hear the debate and watch the vote happen. And he had planned on taking the train back to Richland Center that evening. He hadn't brought a change of clothes or money with him, really. He was just in Madison for the day. So the story is that he borrowed some clothes from a local in Madison. He took his daughter's pocketbook with him, and he got on the train and went to Washington with the papers to try and get Wisconsin's paperwork there first. After a few days on the train, he gets to the Secretary of State's office. He goes in and he turns in his paperwork, and he very smartly asks for a receipt. He asks for a receipt that everything has been turned in and that it's been received. And also he asks that the receipt states specifically that Wisconsin was the first state to turn in their papers. So we have that receipt as part of our collections at the State Historical Society. He waited while they wrote it. And then this picture in the lower right-hand corner is of David James with a number of suffragists who lived in Washington, D.C. They came down to the Secretary of State's office to pose for some pictures as Wisconsin had turned in their paperwork. The newspaper article here, if you read the whole article, it's sort of Wisconsin, it's David's story of his travels and what happened. And in part of the article, he says, while we were standing outside taking those pictures, we saw a taxi pull up with the representative from Illinois who jumped out of their car, ran into the office, and put their papers down on the table and said, I would like to proclaim that Illinois is the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment. To which David and the suffragists outside just started laughing because they knew that they had sort of beaten them to the punch. So Wisconsin is the first state to ratify, but like I said before, we need 36 states to ratify the amendment. So from June of 1919 up through August of 1920, we see various states take up the amendment, debate it, and pass it. And in August of 1920, Tennessee becomes the 36th state to ratify when they pass the amendment. If you've never heard the story of Tennessee's ratification process, it's a great story. You should look it up. The supporters wore certain color roses, and people who were going to vote against it wore different colored roses. And it came down to one vote where someone very famously removed their rose that was one color and changed it out to the other, so that the amendment passes by just one vote. So Tennessee becomes the 36th state to ratify, and then the 19th Amendment becomes a constitutional amendment on August 23rd, 1920. Women are able to vote in the 1920 presidential election, and they helped to elect Warren B. Harding to the presidency. So I think is that right? No, now I lost my note. I'm doubting myself. It might not have been Warren. Rutherford. I'm sorry. I'd have to look it up again. That's embarrassing. I'm sorry. What happens after the 19th Amendment? You've had all these women who have been organized and advocating for so long, and it's not very likely that they're just going to sit down and stop advocating for women's rights. So immediately following the passage of the 19th Amendment, we see the formation of the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters still exists today. It's a bipartisan organization that helps advocate for women's participation in the voting process. We also see the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. In the legislature, that amendment goes out to the states for ratification, and it takes a very, very, very long time before enough states ratify that amendment. In fact, this was just in the news last year when I think Virginia became the last state needed to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. So that amendment is still pending. But it's also important to realize that not every woman was guaranteed the right to vote. The passage of the 19th Amendment doesn't guarantee that everyone has the right to vote, though it should. In 1924, we see more legislation. One act is the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act, which makes all Native American citizens of the United States, and that opens the way for a lot of Native Americans to be allowed to vote in our country. There's also the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which allows a lot of African Americans in our country the right to vote that had previously been denied that right because of Jim Crow laws and other unfair tests that they had to participate in at the polling places. The 26th Amendment is the sort of next instance of where suffrage and voting become an issue in our country, and that is when we change the voting age from 21 to 18. That is in response to the draft and the Vietnam War. So the suffrage movement there's elements of the suffrage movement that are present in all of these acts and all of these areas where voting issues come kind of resurface. The same strategies that the suffragists use are used by all of these other advocacy groups. So it's 100 years later, and where do we stand? So I do not have the most recent election statistics in here because those haven't been certified yet, and also I just haven't had a chance to update my slides. So as of 2018, these are the statistics for how women are represented in public office, because after the passage of the 19th Amendment, the next thing that we see throughout the 20th century is women being the first to take up a lot of offices, right? So the first state legislatures, representatives in state legislature, then in federal government, those walls slowly start to come down. But even when we look at the numbers, currently, women make up 51% of the population, but only 25% of the US Senate, 23% of the US House of Representatives, 28% of state governors, 29% of state legislative seats, 22% of mayors in cities with a population over 30,000, and 0% of presidents of the United States. So if 51% of representation in government is an ultimate goal, perhaps, there's still a long way to go before we get there. And that is my presentation. I am happy to answer any questions, and maybe embarrassingly, we'll look up who became president in 1920.
Okay, well, thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much to Simone for sharing all that wonderful factual information. Like I said, I learned so much, so thank you for enlightening us and letting us know about the path to women's voting. So thank you again for joining us, and have a great week, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.